In 1994, director Quentin Tarantino and star Samuel L. Jackson gave the world an explosive film that shines in its introspective moments.
In 2019, Buffalo Trace gives us a whiskey that refuses to stay on store shelves.
The film is Pulp Fiction.
The whiskey is Weller Antique.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 1994 classic.
Bob, do you know what year it is right now?
It's 2019.
Do you know what year
which
this
means we're
movie
celebrating
came out?
the 25th anniversary of
Pulp Fiction!
Pulp Fiction. Last week we looked at The Lion King, and this week we are making a hard left turn into Tarantinoville. But
children, you can leave this episode.
Yeah, right now. Well, first of all, children, why are you listening to an episode about whiskey? But both of these movies are celebrating their 25th anniversary, and both of these movies have a tie to the current box office, right? So last week we talked about The Lion King. There's a new Lion King coming out. This week, Quentin Tarantino is premiering his new movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So we figured what better time to get in the Wayback Machine and look at Pulp Fiction.
You know what this reminds me of?
What's that?
When we watched that terrible movie, what was it called? Oh, yeah, Goodfellas.
Oh, that one.
And it kind of how Joe Pesci was in Goodfellas in 1990 and also in
Home Alone
in 1990.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, we went from Lion King in 1994 to Pulp Fiction in 1994.
I feel like Pulp Fiction is just, if Scar could have really been himself, he would have been in Pulp Fiction.
Who would he have been?
All of them. He would have been every character in Pulp Fiction.
Okay.
All right, before we get into things, I do want to say that this week begins a new segment we're doing on our podcast that we're calling
Bonus Bonanza.
Bonus Bonanza. Brad and I have been hard at work recording bonus episodes for you. So we've got some where we're in the studio and it's just me and Brad shooting the breeze. We've got a couple where we have actually gone to distilleries. And I want to, spoiler alert here, Brad and I have taken a trip to the great state Commonwealth of Kentucky, and we have interviewed 3 different distillers down there.
Bob, what's Kentucky known for?
Horses?
Well, yeah.
Muhammad Ali?
Louisville. Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
I feel like it's known for something else.
Oh, maybe some bourbon?
Some bourbon.
So Brad and I actually took a trip down to Kentucky. We've interviewed 3 fantastic up-and-coming distilleries there, and we're so excited to get their My Favorite Movie episodes out. So every week for 5 weeks, we are dropping a bonus episode. So you'll get an episode Monday and an episode Thursday. We're calling it Bonus Bonanza.
Bonus Bonanza. Guys, if I can be just completely honest with you, so the main thing that we want to get across to you is we love this podcast. We have so much fun recording our episodes and doing interviews with CEOs and doing blind tastings and doing top 5s. We absolutely love this, and we just want to bring you as much bonus content as we can.
Absolutely. Because we love you guys.
We do.
And gals.
Our loyal listeners.
We love y'all. All right, let's get into talking about this movie.
We've
Pulp
already
Fiction.
gone off a ways, so let's get into Pulp Fiction.
Pulp Fiction, 1994, directed by Quentin Tarantino. This was his second feature-length movie that he directed.
This is gonna be a fun exercise.
Yeah.
If you've never heard of Quentin Tarantino, if somebody came to you and said, Robert, I've never heard of Quentin Tarantino, describe him to me in 3 words. Describe his movies to me. What 3 words would you choose? Can be consecutive into a statement or, just 3 random words.
Nerdy, immature, genius.
Ooh.
I think with Tarantino, it's like I've seen Tarantino type movies done badly. And I know that one that's really popular would be Boondock Saints. Boondock Saints to me feels like a Tarantino type ripoff where the screenwriter and director didn't understand how to actually make a good movie. Tarantino, he does dumb stuff. He is immature.
Ridiculous
stuff. But he also knows how to craft a fantastic movie. And I think that's what we have here with Pulp Fiction.
And not just a fantastic movie, but a fantastic story.
Absolutely.
Which really drives you through the movie. And we've done a Tarantino film before.
Yeah.
We've done Inglourious Bastards. That was one of our first films that we did.
Right.
And now we're coming to what many would say, at the very least, it's Quentin Tarantino's most well-known film.
Absolutely.
If not his best film.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, this is the one that is on the American Film Institute's top 100 movies of all time. This is Tarantino's masterpiece.
This made it to the top 100?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I don't think Brad and I grew up in the 90s, but this movie obviously came out at a time where we could not see it.
Right. We were born in 1990 on the dot.
It is impossible to overstate how much of an impact this movie had on cinema in the 1990s. This movie came out. It was an independent movie. Tarantino burst on the scene after Reservoir Dogs, and this was his follow-up, and it changed everything about how movies were made, how movies were viewed, how people wrote in the 1990s, and cinema ever since.
And my boy Samuel L. Jackson was in it.
We'll get to talking about Samuel L. Jackson. But Brad, I've got some important questions for you. Had you ever seen the movie Pulp Fiction prior to this watch?
I feel like I remember at one point I had seen part of it, but I hadn't seen all of it before.
Okay. So this was your first time that you remember sitting down and watching the whole thing
fully through
in one sitting.
Yeah. And even beyond that, this is one of those movies. We talked about this with Singing in the Rain.
Yeah.
There's like YouTube clips.
Yeah,
of the movie.
You've seen bits and pieces for sure.
Bits and pieces of it, but I'd only seen like maybe the first half of the movie.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I get that. So this movie, it came out in 94. John Travolta, Samuel L. Jackson, Uma Thurman, and Bruce Willis are the stars of this movie. It won 1 Oscar for original screenplay. It was nominated for 6 others.
Define the category original screenplay.
So original screenplay means a screenplay that's not based on something pre-existing. So if it's an adaptation,
Shakespeare,
right? Exactly, an adaptation of a book, an adaptation of a play, those would all be under adapted screenplay. This is something that the author came up with on his or her own that was completely non-existent before it was written.
This is a completely random question. What would you do with a remake then? Like The Lion King?
It would probably be under adapted screenplay.
The Lion King would be?
Even if they're writing a whole new screenplay, they're basing it off of something pre-existing.
Okay.
Yeah. So it won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. It was nominated for 6 more. John Travolta for Best Actor, Samuel L. Jackson as Supporting Actor, Uma Thurman as Supporting Actress. It was also nominated for Best Editing, Best Director, and Best Picture, but it lost out on all of those.
I think editing, I don't know what won editing that year, but the editing on this movie was so crisp and so sharp and just smooth.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So I think it's time that we get into our favorite segment around here. Brad Explains.
Can we rename the segment like Brad Clumsily Explains?
Yeah, I think our listeners already know that you're going to clumsily explain it, Brad. But
thanks, Bob. So Pulp Fiction. If you haven't seen it before, and I'm just going to blanket statement right now, this is another one of those movies that is, to use the only word to describe, is gratuitous. It's a gratuitous movie. It indulges itself. If you're going to watch it, know that lots of bad things happen. Honestly, I think one of my favorite parts about the movie is the opening scene when it's black, and then the definition of the word pulp comes onto the screen.
Yeah.
And it starts with like basically a mushy, smushy substance is the first definition. And the second definition is a novel or literature that is written on crappy material about crappy subjects.
Right.
That's pretty much what it's about.
Like seedy type characters.
Right. And so the essence was that Pulp Fiction was, would you say in the 50s, 60s, 70s?
Yeah, and before that too.
And even before that, they would be these little like paperback novels. Like think about the Beatles, paperback writer.
Yeah.
That they would write these little like crappy paperback novels that were printed on crappy material, and they were just kind of seedy stories about crappy people. And if I had to wrap up my summary, that would be it.
Yeah.
But more fully, there is a crime boss named Marcellus Wallace, and he has 2 kind of goons that work for him who rough people up. They take care of the things that you would imagine mobsters have to take care of. And the film is separated into 3 different
stories.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing about Pulp stories is that you would buy one book of Pulp stories, Pulp Fiction, and it would usually have 3 or 4 completely different stories that had possibly nothing to do with each other, or maybe one character that would go from one to the next.
Kind of an anthology.
Yeah. And that's what the movie is. It's an anthology of 3 stories. It's about these 2 hitmen who work for their boss, Marcellus Wallace. It's hard to sum up. This movie has a lot going on.
Yeah.
Vincent Vega, played by John Travolta, he does a hit in the first part. He takes Marcellus's wife out on a date that's not a date. He's just showing her a good time in the second half. And then in the third half, he's nothing. And Samuel L. Jackson quotes the Bible and kills people.
So I'm going to jump into Brad Explains here because I think you're right. Like, there are 3 distinct stories being told, and sometimes characters from one story will kind of filter in and out of another story. And one thing that Tarantino did is he told 3 small stories out of chronological order for the biggest impact. So the last story in the movie actually probably happens close to the beginning of the chronological story.
Right.
But I think it might be more helpful to talk about the fact that all of the stories in this movie, I think, come down to what the characters are offered at the end of the story. And I think that all 3 of these stories are about characters who do really seedy stuff, finding a saving grace. And if you look at each one of these 3 stories, that's kind of where the narrative goes. You have a setup that's familiar to you. So like the hitman taking out his boss's wife for dinner. Then you have...
That's super familiar to you?
It's super familiar.
Yeah.
Then you have something that comes and complicates it that Tarantino throws in that you would never expect. And what Tarantino's doing is he is trying to get you off balance. Like he's trying to throw a curveball at you that you've never seen before. And so in that first story where John Travolta takes Uma Thurman out for dinner, it's she accidentally overdoses on heroin while in his company. And he has to rescue this guy's wife or face certain death.
Right.
And then at the end of that story, you have those characters kind of finding a moment of saving grace, which is she gets revived. She doesn't die. They both kind of get a new lease on life. They have this handshake agreement to not talk about it with the boss, Marcellus. And it's this really sweet moment where John Travolta kind of blows her a kiss and says goodnight. And that's the end of it. Because what you expect is the big conflict is John Travolta going to have sex with his boss's wife? And what Tarantino throws at you is something completely different. But where you end up is this beautiful moment of kind of redemption for both characters.
Yeah, and the interesting thing for me about that moment is that Tarantino is not afraid to take forever to get there.
No, not at all.
And we talked about this in the Inglourious Basterds episode about how Tarantino wants to stretch that rubber band of tension and of suspense to the point where you think it can't stretch anymore without breaking.
Yeah.
And then stretch it 3 times further.
Right.
And he does that 3 times in this movie, in each, story that he tells.
Yeah.
And you're just always on the edge of your seat.
Absolutely.
But you know what the funniest thing about Europe is?
What?
It's the little differences. I mean, they got the same shit over there that they got here, but it's just there, it's a little different.
Example.
All right, well, you can walk into a movie theater in Amsterdam and buy a beer. And I don't mean just like no paper cup, I'm talking about a glass of beer. And in Paris, you can buy beer in McDonald's. And you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
Oh man, they got the metric system. They wouldn't know what the a quarter pounder is.
And what do they call it?
They call it Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
What do they call a Big Mac?
Big Mac's a Big Mac, but they call it Le Big Mac.
Le Big Mac. What do they call a Whopper?
I don't know. I didn't go on a Burger King.
So the way this movie is set up was obviously not common at the time, telling a movie out of chronological order. And this movie kind of gets held up a lot as an example of postmodern art because of the fact that it just doesn't care about structure. It doesn't care about any of these things. And Tarantino kind of came out and said, listen, part of the fun is that if you understand movies, you're watching the second story, which is about Bruce Willis as a boxer, and you think you're watching the boxing movie Body and Soul, and then suddenly the characters in that story turn a corner and they're in the middle of the movie Deliverance. And if you know anything about Deliverance, it's a movie where these guys get descended upon by, people that live in the mountains and they get raped, essentially. And that's what happens in the second movie. And Tarantino says, you're sitting there as a viewer like, what? How did I get into Deliverance? I was in a boxing movie. What's going on here? And what Tarantino's doing is his whole goal, like I said, is to keep you off balance, to throw things at you that you've never seen, to complicate a situation in a way that it's never been done before. And I think, maybe I'm speaking just for myself here, but I think that every single time Tarantino does that in this movie, it works 100%.
I would like for you to take an Instagram poll.
Yeah.
With this clip.
Yeah.
I don't think almost any of our listeners would have heard of Body and Soul or Deliverance.
I've never heard of Body and Soul. I've heard of Deliverance. It's a really famous movie from the 70s.
Okay.
But Tarantino's whole background is he didn't go to film school. He worked in a video store. He's a nerd. Like, he watched every movie in the video store 100 times, and that's how he got his whole knowledge of how to make a movie, was watching movies called Body and Soul and Deliverance, and thinking, I should mash these up into a movie.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because when you watch Tarantino films, he has such a unique style.
Yeah.
and that's like the most obvious take ever. But he's just so unique in the way that he makes a film. I never thought of it before that he really does do his best to mash different movie styles together. And he does it so poetically and interestingly that he can pull it off.
Yeah.
But I don't know if many directors can.
I don't think they can either. And part of the fun of watching this movie is looking at how each one of these stories, Tarantino kind of has a prologue to each one of them. Like, I think about the second story about the boxer with Bruce Willis. There's this random 4-minute prologue
With Christopher Walken.
And I want to get to that later because it's one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie. But the first story has a prologue with them killing the guys. And then the second story has a prologue with Christopher Walken talking to a young Bruce Willis, you know, when he was a kid. The third story has a prologue, which is the prologue to the whole movie at the beginning, and you have to think back 2 hours.
And we thought that Inception was a new concept.
Right, exactly. But the way this movie is structured is absolutely brilliant, and it's set up that each of these stories are put in their place to have the maximum impact on you.
One of the most interesting things for me about the third act of the movie was that you already knew that Vincent was dead.
Yeah. So
That's like so interesting.
I mean, it's
to
been
me.
25 years. We can spoil everything about the movie, but John Travolta's character, Vincent, he gets killed by Bruce Willis in the second story. And then the third story is basically a jump back in time to something that happened earlier, and we see Vincent alive again. And one of the funny things about how this movie was made, and it's really unpopular to talk about this human being now, but the movie was produced by Harvey Weinstein at Miramax Studios. When Harvey Weinstein was given the script to read for this movie, he took it on an airplane with him. And Tarantino being Tarantino, this script was like 150 pages instead of the standard like 105 or whatever. And so Weinstein starts reading the script and he calls his producer in the middle of the movie, or his lawyer or whoever it is, his agent. And he goes, "What is this movie? You killed off the main character halfway through." And the guy just said, "Just keep reading." And when Weinstein finally got to the end of the movie, he called from the airplane and said, "We have to make this movie. Get Tarantino on board now." But you're exactly right. I mean, they kill the main character halfway through the movie.
So the thing is, there's a lot of different characters in the movie, but would it be okay to say Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta are the main characters?
Yeah, I'd probably
of the
call
movie?
them the leads of the movie, for
Like
sure.
Bruce Willis is almost there because he's the main in the second story.
Right.
But when you look at the bookends of the movie, I mean, it's Samuel L. and John Travolta.
Yeah, I would say John Travolta probably is the main character. If you were gonna well, again, I mean, the Oscars, they put John Travolta up as best actor and they put Samuel L. up as best supporting actor.
But you told me that that's because they don't want them competing for the same thing.
But sometimes they do. I mean, so it really depends on what the studio thinks is the main character.
I would say the fact that the movie finishes with Samuel L. Jackson.
I agree.
I would say he's the main character.
100%. And I think he's the most important character for sure.
Okay.
So, but I do want to say this, like the second story, the one with Bruce Willis.
Yeah.
It's all about this gold watch that
The
Bruce.
Golden Watch.
Yeah, and that's the name of it. It's called the Gold Watch. And for his whole life, Bruce Willis has had this prized possession of a gold watch that his dad wore in Vietnam, and we'll get into Christopher Walken.
Or
Yeah, he wore in a certain place. And it's been passed down for generations. And Bruce Willis is this fighter who was supposed to take a dive and doesn't. And before he can leave town, he finds out that his girlfriend forgot to grab his gold watch off the nightstand. Fabian.
Come on, Fabian.
And so he has to go back and get his gold watch. And shenanigans ensue, okay?
Not shenanigans.
Bad things ensue.
Really bad things ensue.
Bad things.
We
Bad.
could just end the podcast there. Bad things ensue.
The second
Quentin Tarantino directs a movie
called Bad Things.
Bad things ensue.
So this second story is always kind of held up as the part where the movie sags. And I think it's because it's 2.5 hour movie. This is the middle of the movie. But watching it back this time, I have to say, I think the second story is way better than people give it credit for.
When you said the word sags, I was surprised.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely the slowest moving. It's like a slow burn because there's more action. People get shot and stuff in the other ones.
Samuel Jackson is quoting the Bible.
But when you really take a step back and you realize this is an anthology, I think each one of these chapters, if you want to call them that, work perfectly on their own.
One of my favorite camera shots from the movie was in the second chapter when Bruce Willis gets out of the car. He's going back to his apartment to get the Golden Watch, and the camera follows him through a set of apartment buildings, through a field, he's kind of checking out his own apartment buildings.
Yep.
At first you think You're like, man, he just parked in front of his own apartment building. He's an idiot.
Right.
But that single following camera shot as he goes through the fence.
It's beautiful.
It's so good.
It's a great shot.
Yeah.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about this because I feel like our podcast today is just all over the place, but that's because this movie has this weird sort of episodic feel to it. So maybe we should just jump into talking about our favorite scenes in the movie.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I wrote down like 7 or 8 scenes, and they just basically span the whole movie because the whole movie is just a great scene.
Yeah.
You got the prologue with Jackson and Travolta where Samuel L. Jackson eats a cheeseburger and shoots a guy and quotes the Bible.
You read the Bible, Greg?
Yes.
Well, there's this passage I got memorized. Sort of fits this occasion. Ezekiel 25:17. The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who in the name of charity and goodwill shepherds the weak through the valley of darkness, for he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know my name is the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
It's fantastic.
That's probably the most well-known scene of the movie.
I would think so.
I
Well,
would say.
there might be one that's more well-known than that, and that would be the second one I wrote down, which is the dance between John Travolta and Uma Thurman. That's
yeah.
become an iconic moment.
Yeah, you're probably
and
right.
you basically got fat John Travolta, who was in a total career slump at this point. I mean, they
Really?
did not want to hire him, and Tarantino was like, this movie doesn't get made if I can't hire John Travolta.
Really?
This movie, complete career turnaround for John Travolta.
That's really interesting.
But you've got this iconic character of the 70s from Saturday Night Fever and Grease getting on the screen and dancing again.
Yeah.
And it doesn't get better than that. But one of the key scenes in this movie is in the first story where Mia Wallace, played by Uma Thurman, has overdosed, and John Travolta has to plunge a needle through her breastplate and into her heart to restart her heart.
Yeah.
It was at the New York Film Festival, and they started screening this movie, and it got to the scene with the needle, and someone fainted in the audience. And they had to rush down the aisles and find a doctor to revive this person because the scene was so intense that someone passed out.
Dang.
And Weinstein actually came out afterwards and said, I was afraid people thought that that would have been one of my publicity stunts, but it really happened.
Wow.
Because it was so intense.
So I'm not going to lie, for me, that scene almost felt like it was a little bit forced.
Interesting. How so?
Like for me, that scene, the rest of the movie really felt smooth, and it felt like that scene they were trying to force not a laugh. That wasn't my favorite scene in the movie.
One of the things I love about that scene is that they can find ways to get humor into it, even as you are on the edge of your seat. John Travolta's arguing with his drug dealer. He takes Uma Thurman to the house of his drug dealer to try to revive her because he knows he can't take her to a hospital. And they're bickering back and forth while Uma Thurman is just like laying there on her front lawn.
You know what I think it is? I didn't like the performance of the drug dealer.
Interesting.
He just kind of struck me as this, oh man, I don't know. There's something about the drug dealer that's just kind of like fake to me.
Huh.
It doesn't feel sincere.
So that actor is Eric Stoltz. He was a
Right.
pretty famous actor in the 80s. And Tarantino kind of gave him a couple parts that he could pick from in this movie,
Okay.
and he picked that part.
Was one of the other parts the part Jimmy actually played by Tarantino?
Yes, that was the other part that he gave him an option to take.
I could see Eric Stoltz playing that role as well.
Playing Tarantino's part in the third story.
Yes.
Interesting. I'm glad you picked that out because that was the other option that he gave him.
Yeah, I could totally see him doing that role as well. And I think he would have been better in that role.
Okay.
I don't know. There's something about this role that just felt fake and forced to me. And granted, it's a minor role in the movie.
Yeah,
so it's not like
absolutely.
it ruins the movie or anything.
Yeah.
And he did fine in the role. I just didn't care for it. And so maybe that's the reason why I didn't care for that scene quite as much.
Yeah. One of the things that you don't really notice as you watch this movie is how big and expansive it really is. And I realized it when I was watching that scene with Bruce Willis that you were referring to a minute ago as he was walking through rows of apartment buildings, that as you watch each story, it's so immersive that you kind of forget about the other characters in the other stories.
Which I love.
I love that too. And you don't realize Tarantino made this movie on, I think, like an $8 million budget. And it has so many characters, so many actors, so many extras. It's essentially like an epic film being told on this really small independent movie budget and scale that you don't quite realize how big it is at times.
That's $8 million.
Yeah.
That includes paying Samuel L. Jackson. And
Everyone took a pay cut for this movie.
Yeah.
And some of the bigger actors took a percentage of the profits, but no one knew it was going to be as huge of a cultural phenomenon as it was. They just wanted to really work with this new up-and-coming director.
So was this a cult hit, or did it truly make millions at the box office?
Oh, it made a ton of money at the box office.
Really?
So Tarantino made this movie Reservoir Dogs in 1992. It went to the Cannes Film Festival, and he was in demand from that point on. And he'd already been developing Pulp Fiction. So they gave him a way bigger budget for Pulp Fiction, even though it seems paltry, right?
Right.
He went off and made Pulp Fiction.
I don't know, man. $8 million does not seem paltry to me.
Well, not to me, right?
I wish I had $8 million right now.
He makes Pulp Fiction. They sell it on the power of people like Bruce Willis, who's one of the biggest movie stars in the world at that point. It goes to the Cannes Film Festival, and it wins the big prize, which is called the Palme d'Or, the Golden Palm.
Explain Cannes just in a few words.
Yeah. So it's this film festival. It's held in France. It's considered like the most prestigious film festival. It's also the one where the most critics go. And in France, like at the Cannes Film Festival, people will like boo your movie during the movie if they don't like it.
Really?
It's just this crazy atmosphere.
Huh.
So this movie wins essentially Best Picture, the Golden Palm. And from there, it takes off. Weinstein does his thing. He pressures Academy voters. He does everything he's supposed to do. This movie gets nominated for Best Picture.
So Weinstein's good at pressuring people.
Yeah, right? Who would have thunk? But it blows up at the box office. I think it makes like cumulatively like $200-something million.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So like I said, Brad, this movie is a cultural phenomenon.
Man, looking at 90s culture, that's amazing to me. That I just feel like 90s culture hadn't fully let go of its 50, like we want to be like the 50s and wholesome.
Well,
and
this
all
movie
that.
shook that out of the 90s.
That's what I'm saying.
And that's the thing is we talk about 90s culture, and in a way, Pulp Fiction is 90s culture. Like, we're still in the earlier part of the 90s. We're getting into the mid 90s now, but I feel like the decade hadn't really defined itself. And then Pulp Fiction comes out, and from this point on, everything we look back on culturally in mass media, in TV, in movies, it is because of Pulp Fiction.
And I don't necessarily want to use the word raunchy.
Well, what you had was you came out off of the 1980s, and if you remember like action movies of the 80s, they were like larger than life. It was
Terminator.
It was, well, yeah, and all the other ones that Schwarzenegger made after that, Commando and Predator. You had Sylvester Stallone making tons and tons of gratuitously violent movies, and here you have this guy Tarantino, who he has gratuitous violence, but then he also has two characters sitting in a car talking about what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris, and he really shifts the paradigm of what it means to make an R-rated movie, and it's all about dialogue.
I never thought about that before, but when you compare it to the gratuitous films of the 80s, Tarantino is light years ahead of what they were doing. I mean, he takes film to a whole new level of, and that's the problem and the genius of Tarantino.
Absolutely.
Is he just an idiot that makes gratuitously gross movies, or is he a genius?
Yeah.
That understands the human psyche and the human soul in ways that most people don't.
Yeah. Here's the crazy thing about this movie. I've probably seen it, 15 times. I love this movie. Brad, you really like this movie too. And we're like a half hour into this podcast now, and I feel like we haven't even really gotten our minds around how to talk about it, how to start talking about it. We haven't talked about any of the performances.
Yeah.
We haven't talked any analysis of this movie. We're just getting our initial thoughts out there, and we're already at the time where we need to take a break. It's time for us to try some whiskey.
I need some
we need
whiskey real
this
bad.
whiskey right now. So Brad, what do you say that we try Weller Antique?
Let's do it, man.
All right, so today we're talking about Weller Antique. Now, we have tried Weller Special Reserve, which was Weller's green label, a couple weeks ago. And we're continuing our Summer of Bourbon. We're in
Summer of Bourbon.
We're in week 5 of the Summer of Bourbon, so there's one more to follow this.
Oh, Bob, I'm sad.
I know, right?
I love
But I
bourbon.
promised when we tried Weller Special Reserve that I would bring Weller Antique. Weller Antique, full disclosure, this might be my favorite bourbon.
Really?
It's a $30 bourbon.
Well, I think it smells like crap, Bob.
If you can find it at retail, it is a steal. It's $30 in the state of Ohio, and I got it for $30.
Good job.
But this is one of the 2 Wellers that you mix to make what they call poor man's Pappy.
You know what, dude? The more we've done this podcast, the more I'm like, what's so stinking special about Pappy?
And that's the thing, is that people who have had Pappy and who know Pappy pre the bourbon boom say Weller Antique might be better than Pappy. And so if you can get it for $30, please do. But if you go, in other states, people are marking this up to like $200 a bottle. It's insane, Brad.
This.
What we're drinking today.
$200.
$200. So Weller Antique comes from Buffalo Trace Distillery. It is bottled at 107 proof, so it's a little bit higher proof.
That's one of the highest proofs we've drank.
Yeah. So there's no age statement on it. We know that means it has to be at least 4 years old. The youngest in the blend has to be 4.
Right.
Most people guess that this is closer to like a 6-year-old blend. Brad, what are you picking up on the nose of this one?
You know, this is giving me very fresh notes. And I don't want to say bright.
Uh-huh.
Bright's a different word. It feels very refreshing to me.
Yeah.
Like a glass of cold water on a hot day. I don't know.
Yeah, it definitely is a little bit brighter, a little bit more fruity smelling than the Special Reserve that we had. Now, we have been letting this mellow in our glasses for a couple of minutes, so we may have missed some of those initial smells that you get with the bourbon of a vanilla, the oak, the brown sugar, the maple. The ethanol for sure. Why don't we go ahead and score this out, though, before we give it a sip? What would you give it on the nose, Brad?
This is one of the most pleasant bourbons I've smelled. I'm going to give it an 8.
An 8 on the nose.
That's pretty high, but I like it.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and give it a 7 on the nose. It's not unpleasant, as Brad said, but it's also not doing a ton for me. And I think part of that is because we've been letting it sit for a couple minutes. I'm super excited to taste it. Why don't we give it a taste, Brad?
I think that there's certain notes of vanilla that hit through in ways that I haven't seen with other bourbons.
Yeah. What I love about this bourbon is that it is a perfect encapsulation for me of everything I want people to understand about bourbon. There's a little bit of smoke, but for me, I've said this before, I love sweet bourbons, and this is a sweet, sweet bourbon.
So Plato, the philosopher, had these ideas of
The ideal.
Yeah. Which essentially an ideal was the perfect version of what you would find on Earth.
Yeah.
So this would be your platonic ideal.
Look, I'm not saying this is
bourbon.
a perfect bourbon. What I'll say is this.
But as close as it could come to on Earth.
No. Here's what I'll say about it. It has everything. It checks all the boxes that you want to introduce someone to whiskey or to bourbon with. Yeah. It's got a little bit of an interesting like briny flavor to me. There's a little bit of that like saltiness, but overwhelmingly sweet. It's 107 proof, so you get an alcohol burn. It's got some spice to it. The finish is pleasant. It's not bitter. It goes down smooth. It gives you that Kentucky hug. It literally, for me, it checks every box. If you were going to come to my house and say, what's a bourbon? I would say, here's some Weller Antique.
Huh. I would agree with you on everything you just said. Mm-hmm. It has nice qualities in all of it.
Yeah.
But in a sense, don't crucify me for this, is a jack of all trades, a master of none.
Yeah, I get that.
There is a sense of this isn't every man's bourbon.
Yep.
And I guess, honestly, like you said, it's a $30 bourbon.
Right.
So it's not trying to be over the top at anything, but it's good at all of it.
Yeah. All right, so Brad, what would you score this on the taste?
On the taste, I'm going to give it a 7. It doesn't quite live up to the hype of the nose for me.
Okay.
But it's still in a above average isn't quite good enough of a statement.
Yeah.
Above average.
It's good.
Kind of like ancient age. Just add another adjective.
I'm tipping my hand here. I'm giving this a 9.5 on taste.
Wow.
I love this bourbon. This is everything I want in a bourbon.
That's really high, Bob.
I've told you, man. I love sweet bourbons. This is a sweet, high-proof bourbon that isn't aggressive. Yeah. It's not harsh.
Yeah, it doesn't punch you in the face like a lot of the ryes do.
I mean, if I asked you to guess if this was what the proof was on this, would you have guessed this was 107 proof?
Above 90, like a 94.
Yeah.
96.
Yeah.
Something like that.
And it's rare to get something that's over 100 proof that doesn't give you that sort of like tongue-punching aggressiveness.
Tongue-punching!
All right, so Brad gave it a 7. I gave it a 9.5. Finish. What do you think?
The finish is smooth. And I say that in a good way and a bad way. Like, there's not a ton going on the finish. Mm-hmm. But that's a good thing. It moves from the taste down the palate, down the throat, and it doesn't punch you in any way. It doesn't hit you hard.
A little bit of smoke.
Yeah, I would probably give it a 7.5 on the finish.
I'm over here like kissing the bottle, as Brad says. I love
Bob's
this
turning
whiskey.
real Italian.
I am. I'm like blowing kisses and mwah. I'm gonna give it an 8.5. It doesn't have a perfect finish, but for what it is, I mean, it's just great. Brad, what would you score it at?
Finish-wise, I would probably say about an 8.
An 8.
It's a nice, smooth finish that you would expect from a bourbon.
Yep. Overall balance.
I'm going to give it an 8 as well.
An 8.
Yeah, it moves from nose to taste to finish really smoothly. If I had to use one word to describe this, it's smooth.
Yeah.
Man. Smooth.
The only thing that I'm going to knock it for on the balance is that I didn't find the nose to be really compelling. And it may have just been the glass I was using. And Brad and I are actually using different glasses for this tasting, and we swapped glasses halfway through.
It changes things.
Brad, your glass has a little bit more like a fluted thing going on, and the nose was fantastic on yours. But
Which
the taste was completely different.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and say, on overall balance, I'm going to give it an 8.5. It's still incredibly well balanced. I would have liked a little bit more out of that nose. And so that brings us to our final category, which is value. Now, we've already said it's a $30 bourbon. You might be paying $200 for it if you're in a different state.
Which is insane.
You shouldn't pay $200 for any bourbon ever. I'm serious. Like,
I would probably agree with that statement.
And 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you wouldn't be.
Right.
But the way that this bubble has been building, you're paying thousands of dollars for certain bourbons now. And it's just astronomically, it's ridiculous. So if you can get it at cost.
Even at $40.
Let's say $40. In Ohio, it's $29.99.
Right.
But let's just say at $40, what's your value score, Brad?
At a $40 price point, I would probably give it a 7.
Yeah.
At a $30,
that's what it is. I paid $29.99 for this.
Let's just go with what we paid. At $29.99, 8.5.
All right, I'm giving it a 10.
10 out of 10.
Name me a $30 bourbon that's better than this.
I like that James E. Pepper 1776 a lot.
All right.
I would put that in a similar category of this, and that was $31.
But again, I mean, if those are the only two,
yeah, I can't think of many.
Then that would be a 10 for me. I can't find a $30 bourbon better than this.
I'll up myself to a 9.
All right, Brad's giving it a 9. I'm giving it a 10. That puts Brad out to a 40 out of 50. And that puts your boy Bob up to a 43.5, which puts us at an average of 41.75. We did it!
New top whiskey!
This is our top. And look, I knew I was going to skew the score a little bit, but I'm so happy to see that Brad gave this a 40 out of 50.
This is a good bourbon.
This is just darn good, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, our last one that we had this high was a Glenmorangie La Santa.
Yeah.
Right? And
which was great.
I think we averaged out to like a 39.
Yeah, something close to it. We may have come to a 40.
Yeah. And that's a Scotch, and it's a completely different whiskey, and you might as well have completely different categories for them. But this is a really great bourbon.
Yeah.
I think your description is the best. If you want somebody to understand the highs that bourbon has to offer, toss them some of this Weller Antique. If you have to pay $200 a bottle of it, don't do that. Buy Heaven Hill Green Label and show them that.
I will say this. I think at the time I tried it, the best whiskey I had ever had was Old Forester Prohibition.
Okay.
The 1920. That's $60 a bottle. I can buy 2 bottles of this for the price of one Old Forester Prohibition. Now that is like a completely different beast. It's 119 proof or something, way thicker. It's a completely different bourbon.
Very good bourbon.
It's very good. For $30, you cannot buy a better bourbon than Weller Antique.
Go buy it now.
Right now. So
stop listening to the podcast.
Brad, would you recommend? It's a redundant question.
No.
Right.
Terrible whiskey.
Yeah, this might be my favorite whiskey.
Go buy it.
It's so good.
Go buy it.
Go buy it.
Go buy it.
I'm so happy we're talking about it with Pulp Fiction because it's something I can recommend alongside a movie I'd recommend. Let's talk about it. So that was Weller Antique. What do you say we get back into talking about Pulp Fiction, Quentin Tarantino's 1994 masterpiece? Brad,
true masterpiece.
I mean, seriously, it is. It's the work of a master, and there's so many directions that we can go with this.
Yeah,
we haven't talked about the acting at all, the performances.
Yeah.
So why don't we just run down the list here? We'll start with.
Do we want to start with the lesser actors?
How do you want to go?
Let's start with the lesser actors and move towards the Samuel and John.
All right. Well, why don't you lead the way here? What lesser actor do you want to talk about here?
Ving Rhames.
Ving Rhames is fantastic.
Yeah. Honestly, one of my favorite scenes from the movie, and not because it's technically brilliant or anything, I mean, it's well done. When Bruce Willis is driving, and he's singing the song, and he's jamming, and he pulls up to the stoplight, and the little old lady's walking by. I mean, I don't know, somebody walks by. But then Marcellus Wallace, Ving Rhames, walks in front, and he kind of stops. And literally, he like takes like half a step backwards and looks at the car,
And he sees that it's Bruce Willis.
And he sees that it's Bruce Willis.
Yeah.
I love
It's
that
so
scene.
funny.
It's so funny.
Quentin Tarantino said that he respected Ving Rhames so much because the key scene in the second story is that Bruce Willis sees Ving Rhames, who is the guy that's going to try to kill him, when he goes back to get his gold watch. He steps on the gas, he runs Ving Rhames over. They end up chasing each other through the streets. They end up in this pawn shop where they're knocked unconscious by what can only be described as a hillbilly. And they wake up in the basement of this pawn shop, and they find out that they are in the middle of some weird sex, kinky stuff, and that these guys are going to keep them and rape them. And Tarantino said that he respected Ving Rhames so much because he was the only actor that he tested that did not mind the rape scene. And he said Ving Rhames was so confident in his masculinity that he's the only one that didn't ask Tarantino, what's this going to do for my screen image and my persona? And he was completely committed to doing the scene.
And since then, he's just been Ving Rhames in Mission Impossible.
Yeah, I mean,
And
it
he's
didn't
perfect.
hurt his career at all. And I think that kind of teaches us a little bit of a lesson in that Ving Rhames didn't care what was going on in that scene. So, why should we in some way? But this was something that was like...
We should care about it because that was
That's a hard scene to get through, for sure.
It's super difficult.
But what I'm saying is all the actors that auditioned for that scene, that was their hang up. They were saying, like, you got to cut away or I won't do it. Ving Rhames said, I understand the weight that this has for the story, and I'm completely all in, committed to doing it.
Yeah, if we can just address for a second that scene, because I think that scene is the reason why Pulp Fiction is such a hard movie to ever recommend.
Yeah.
And I know we're getting to the very end of
Sure.
the episode where we normally say, would you recommend? It's hard for me to recommend any movie that would include that type of material.
Yeah. I completely understand. And we talked about Inglourious Bastards when we reviewed that one. And that movie has some over-the-top, comically exaggerated violence.
Right.
I hated watching the guys get scalped in that movie.
Right.
This is a different beast. I think that its themes go way deeper and way darker.
Yes.
When we see John Travolta injecting heroin into his veins in what is only presented as the way it's filmed, it's glamorized almost.
Right.
When you see the brutality of Ving Rhames getting raped, I mean, you can't recommend this movie because people's tolerance to these things are going to be all over the place.
Right.
It's not just that it's the violence of the movie. It's the way that every action taken in the movie is violent.
Yes. There's something about this movie that is so otherworldly.
Yeah.
Almost like holy, of like, this movie just evokes these sense of like Samuel L. Jackson, especially when he gives his biblical quote from Ezekiel.
Yeah.
You just get this sense of otherworldliness that this movie isn't normal. It's way beyond the plane of normal movies. And it makes me go, I don't know what to do with this movie. And it's all encapsulated in the second act when Bruce Willis and Ving Rhames are dealing with hillbillies who want to sodomize them. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if I could ever recommend this movie, but I don't know if I could ever not recommend this.
So the first thing I would say to that, Brad, is I think I used a word earlier to describe this movie, and it was epic. And I think in some ways we have to look at Tarantino the way we look at like a Tolkien or a C.S. Lewis or any of these people who craft these worlds, because Tarantino does an amazing job of world building in this movie. And part of the reason this movie affects us the way it does is that it's so immersive. We get into the world of this movie and it's so unique and it's like nothing we've ever seen. And we buy what Tarantino is selling.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes across as authentic and it comes across as unique because we don't see it anywhere else. But the reason this movie hits us at the level that it does is because Tarantino is so good at world building.
Right. Yeah. Let's delve back into performances.
Yeah. So I want to get back into talking about performances. And one of the ones, to lighten the mood a little bit here, that I loved so much was Christopher Walken, because I think his scene, his 1 5-minute scene or whatever it is fantastic. And what I love about what Tarantino does is he's underrated as a director, because when you look at the list of people in this movie, he has a bunch of actors that are not known for their subtlety, and he makes them play really subtle. Like Christopher Walken in this scene where he's talking to this young boy, Butch. For most of the scene, he's talking in like a really quiet, reverent tone, and you don't see Christopher Walken do that very often. I mean, you've got Walken, you've got John Travolta, you've got Harvey Keitel, and Samuel L. Jackson none of whom are known for being like quiet, introspective people. And he puts them in these situations where you absolutely buy Samuel L. Jackson, in a face-to-face with Tim Roth talking about the Bible in a really hushed way. And he brings that out of his actors. I'm super impressed by what he does as a director.
I would be really interested to see like behind the scenes footage of Tarantino coaching his actors.
Oh, for sure.
You know what I mean? On how to evoke the emotions that they show and to give them their motivation and why they're doing the things they do.
Yep.
I just feel like Tarantino would be fascinating to listen to.
Absolutely. Any thoughts on Christopher Walken?
Christopher Walken is such an interesting character because of the cadence of his voice.
Yeah.
That like any role he does, you're kind of like, oh, well, that's Christopher Walken just being Christopher Walken.
Right.
This role felt different.
It did.
Because he wasn't just relying on the cadence of his voice to kind of create intrigue and interest.
Yeah.
His storytelling ability in this scene was...
One of the things I noticed in this movie that you don't get in later Tarantino is that he'll just kind of sit the camera like in the corner of a room and let characters go in and out of frame, and that shot will last for like a minute and a half. And what they do with Christopher Walken is they just put the camera on his face, and it's like an extreme close-up. It's from eyebrows to chin, and that's it. And Walken holds the camera for, I don't know, probably a minute at a time, and it's really compelling to watch.
This watch was on your daddy's wrist when he was shot down over Hanoi. He was captured, put in a Vietnamese prison camp. He knew that if the ever saw the watch, it'd be confiscated, taken away. The way your dad looked at it, this watch was your birthright. You'd be damned if any was going to put the greasy yellow hands on his boy's birthright. So he hid it. In one place he knew he could hide something, his ass. 5 long years he wore this watch, up his ass. Then he died of dysentery. Give me the watch. I hid this uncomfortable hunk of metal up my ass 2 years. Then, after 7 years, I was sent home to my family, and now, little man, I give the watch to you.
And then when he finally gets to the point in his story where he says, I put this watch in my butt, like, it becomes so funny because it's so unexpected. And again, we talked about Tarantino kind of subverting expectations, but you're with Christopher Walken because he's crafting this really serious drama about this watch that's been passed down for generations. And then all of a sudden he introduces, yeah, I wore this inside my butt for 5 years and here you go. Now it's
Yeah.
All right, so let's zoom back a little bit from that, and I want to talk about the leads, but very briefly. I mean, what are we going to say that hasn't been said before? Like, Samuel L. Jackson is good? Like, we all know this. We know Travolta was not wanted by the studio, and Tarantino dug his heels in, and he got Travolta. I think Travolta's fantastic.
Can you tell me more about that story at all?
Yeah, so throughout the 1980s, Travolta had become basically like box office poison. You know, he made a sequel to Saturday Night Fever that was a bomb. He was in a few bombs in the 80s. And by the time you get to the early 90s, he's making these movies called Look Who's Talking, which are about talking babies. And he's like the voiceover of the talking baby.
Really?
Yeah, dude, he had kind of hit the skids a little bit. And so Tarantino really, really wanted him. And Harvey Weinstein had said, listen, I can get you Daniel Day-Lewis right now for this role. Daniel Day-Lewis wants to play Vincent Vega.
Really?
Tarantino said no. And part of me really wants to see what a Daniel Day-Lewis Vincent Vega looks like. But we didn't get Daniel Day-Lewis. We got John Travolta. And I think they made the right call.
Yeah.
What did you think of Bruce Willis in this movie?
I would say one of his best performances because Bruce Willis shines when he moves from one extreme to the other. You know what I mean? Like, when I think about him in The Sixth Sense, Haley Joel Osment is the star of that movie.
Right.
But, like, honestly, Bruce Willis kind of turns in a blasé performance in that movie where he just kind of mopes through the movie.
Yeah.
Which works for his role. But, like, in this movie, you get Bruce Willis at his best where he plays that cool, calm boxer who's fully in control of everything.
Yep.
To the psychotically angry that his girlfriend forgot the most important thing to him in the world.
Yeah.
There's something about him that Bruce Willis makes that transition from calm to psychotic so well that you get the best of that in this movie.
Absolutely. And I don't know that I would call his performance, like in The Sixth Sense, for instance, blasé, but I think it gets at what you're saying. I think Bruce Willis does the best when he's given material where he's allowed to have quiet moments.
Yes.
Because so many of his movies, especially now that he's getting into, older adulthood, where he's just making these direct-to-DVD action movies, are all about covering up those moments where he's not vulnerable, where he is just blowing stuff up all the time. But the reason we loved him in The Sixth Sense and the reason we love him in this movie is because there's so many stretches where he has to carry the scene as an actor in a quiet moment. And I think he nails it here.
Yeah, his scenes with Fabienne in the hotel room.
He does.
He hits every note that you need him to hit.
Right.
Whether it's the low notes, the chill notes, the quiet notes, or the angry, the furious. He moves between those two extremes so well.
Yeah.
And it's funny, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing one of the other actors in the entire pantheon of actors that does it so well, Samuel L. Jackson.
Yeah. And I think it's time we talk about Samuel L. Jackson because, in my opinion, not only does he steal the movie, but he's the key to the whole movie.
It's interesting because if you just watch the YouTube clips of this movie and you only see him quoting Ezekiel and, gunning down a guy, you don't get the full breadth of what Samuel L. Jackson does in this movie.
And it makes me kind of sad not for where his career went, because obviously he's had a great career.
For sure.
But it's very rare that we see him operate on this level of subtlety. That final scene in the diner where he's talking in a very quiet tone to the guy that he has at gunpoint, and he's telling him all about that Bible verse and what it means to him.
And you will know I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon you. I've been saying that shit for years. And if you heard it, that meant your ass. I never gave much thought to what it meant. I just thought it was some cold-blooded shit to say to him before I popped a cap in his ass. But I saw some shit this morning made me think twice. See, now I'm thinking, maybe it means you're the evil man, and I'm the righteous man. And Mr. 9mm here, he used to shepherd protecting my righteous ass in the valley of darkness. Or it could mean you're the righteous man and I'm the shepherd. And it's the world that's evil and selfish. Now, I'd like that. But that shit ain't the truth. The truth is, you're the weak. And I'm the tyranny of evil men. But I'm trying, Ringo. I'm trying real hard to be the shepherd.
You see something in Samuel L. Jackson's eyes and in his tone of voice that he covers up so often by yelling things. And I just feel like maybe he's worked with lesser directors or something, but I want that Samuel L. Jackson all the time because he knocks it out of the freaking park.
I was going to say, I feel like Tarantino lets him go there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He gives him the freedom to do with that part what he will, and he nails it. He, like you said, he knocks it out of the park.
Absolutely. And I want to focus in on that last scene because I think it's time we get into our analysis and our final scores a little bit. The whole key to this movie is Samuel L. Jackson's character of Jules Winfield. And it's really a story about Jules's redemption.
Right.
It really is. And I think, like I said earlier, on a smaller scale, it's a story about a lot of these characters kind of finding their saving grace. At the end of Bruce Willis's story, he rides out on a motorcycle and the name of the motorcycle is Grace.
Right.
You know what I mean?
For sure.
But in Samuel L. Jackson's story, you see it happen in the most explicit way. And he starts talking about how God intervened in his life and that he doesn't understand why. He doesn't understand what it is, but he understands that he says, I felt the touch of God. And John Travolta says, why? He says, I don't know why, but he knows that he says, I can't go back to sleep. And what this movie is really about is these two paths that these two characters take, because Jules, Samuel L. Jackson, leaves the life of crime. We don't see him in the story with Bruce Willis, and we know that John Travolta doesn't think that this is a miracle, decides to continue on in this life of crime, and he dies because of it.
Right.
And so it really is a story about redemption. And Samuel L. Jackson even said, the people in this movie, in Pulp Fiction, the people who are worth saving get saved. The two robbers, Pumpkin and Honey Bunny, get saved. They get another chance. That's their redemption. Uma Thurman's character, he said, has the chance to die, but she didn't die. Butch, Bruce Willis's character, gets another chance. Marcellus Wallace even gets another chance. And I think he's getting at something here. And Brad, I want to know what your take is on what you think kind of the moral of the story is here, and whether Tarantino kind of nails it with the way that he wrote it.
That's so hard. Is there a moral to this story?
Yeah.
Because I look at this movie and I just think to myself, man, when you see all of the horror that happens in this movie, of the crazy things that go on, like, can there be something redeeming to it? And I think that there is. There's something about this movie that taps into the depth of humanity's depravity and brokenness that when you look at the end and you look at where Jules comes to, you see that there's a point where he has a certain faith in a better world or a better place or a better plan that God has for him that Vincent never comes to.
Right.
That Vincent has this doubt about. And you see how it turns out. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the third scene of the movie is that you know that Vincent Vega is dead.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but as we've been talking about this movie, that fact has grown on me to consume, to be the whole point of this movie is the third act knowing what happens in the second act, which is chronologically the final part of the movie. But the fact that they have that conversation in the diner at the end of the movie, and not even they, John and Samuel, they, Samuel Jackson and the robber have this conversation about grace and redemption.
Yeah.
And he realizes that these people are the sheep that need to be protected.
Yeah.
And that God has called him to protect these people. And then you realize the fact that Vincent doesn't understand that lesson and he's actually dead.
Yeah.
There's so many things going on there
yeah.
that I go, Tarantino is beyond any of us.
What I love about, and I said this in our Inglourious Bastards episode, and I'm glad that I can say it again now. I feel like Tarantino makes a movie that's super nihilistic and dark and has no point. And then he makes a movie about redemption. And it seems like he goes in this cycle. So like Reservoir Dogs, and I know you haven't seen it. I'd love to watch it with you soon. It has this very nihilistic tone to it. Pulp Fiction has a redemptive tone. We talked about Inglourious Bastards. It seems like it's super nihilistic.
Yes.
And cynical. Django Unchained is hopeful. It's redemptive. And I think Tarantino's at his best when he's writing towards redemption.
For sure.
So, Brad, if you had to give this movie a score out of 10, with the challenges that it presents, but also knowing what a landmark of cinema this is, and still 25 years later, what a unique vision this is, what would you give it?
9.5.
I think I'm right there with you. I want to give it a 10.
See, that I wanted to give it a 9.
Yeah. But I think we have to meet in the middle here a little bit. There are a couple things in this movie that I don't think have aged super well. I think there's a couple little pacing issues, but overall, you know what? Forget. No, I'm giving it a 10. I have to give it a 10. It's just, I started it, and about 15 minutes in, I was like, oh, maybe I won't like this as much because I'm watching it with a more critical eye. And by the end of it, I was like, nope, it still takes me there every single time. It takes you on a journey that no other movie can. I'm giving it a 10 out of 10.
I'm sticking at a 9.5 out of 10.
All right.
For me, the true struggle that I have, do you need to delve into the true depravity of humanity to get to the lessons that he does?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you do.
Well, and I think that just comes with the territory with Tarantino.
It does,
He's never not going to take us there.
100%.
Yep.
Tarantino, I don't know how to describe it. He's ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
The way that he takes you to places is absurd and over the top doesn't even begin to describe what he's doing.
Yeah.
And that's why I can't give it a 10 out of 10 because I don't know if we have to go as deep as he takes us.
Yep. I get that. This is not a movie that's going to be for everybody.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I would tell, my mom to watch this movie.
I hope you know that you wouldn't tell.
Yeah,
your
absolutely.
mom to watch this
Absolutely.
movie.
That doesn't mean that it's not a singularly unique piece of movie making.
Right.
And that's what this is. So Brad gave it a 9.5. I gave it a 10. But we want to know what you think. So please hop on Twitter, hop on Instagram, hop on Facebook. Hit us up on social media. Brad, where can they find us?
At Film Whiskey with an E.
At Film Whiskey. Next week, we will be back talking about the 2009 hit 500 Days of Summer.
I feel like we've gone from Lion King
We're all over
to
the
Pulp
map,
Fiction
man.
to 500 Days
We'll
of Summer.
introduce a little bit of levity next week. We'll talk about 500 Days of Summer for the Film and Whiskey Podcast. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
We'll see you next time.